The United States Navy officially denies it ever happened. But the men who were there, the ones who survived with their minds intact, spoke of something far worse than a simple disappearance. They spoke of bodies fused alive into the steel bulkheads of the ship, of sailors driven permanently mad by a glimpse into another world, and of an experiment so terrifying the government buried it under a mountain of secrecy for over 80 years. The story begins not with a legend, but with a desperate need. It was 1943, the bloodiest year of the Second World War. The Atlantic was a graveyard, and Allied ships were being sent to the bottom by German U-boats faster than they could be built. Victory depended on a technological miracle, a way to make a warship invisible. At the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, a project of unimaginable ambition was underway, cloaked in the highest levels of classification. The objective, codenamed Project Rainbow, was to bend light and radio waves around a vessel, rendering it undetectable to the enemy. The key was rumored to be a radical application of Albert Einstein's unified field theory, a theoretical bridge between electromagnetism and gravity. The test subject was a newly commissioned destroyer escort, the USS Eldridge, DE-173. On its decks, massive electromagnetic generators were installed, humming with a power that seemed to defy the known laws of physics. The crew were told it was a new kind of degaussing system to protect against magnetic torpedoes. The truth was infinitely more dangerous. On the morning of October 28, 1943, the order was given. The generators spooled up, their drone rising to an unbearable shriek. Witnesses on nearby ships reported a bizarre, greenish-blue fog slowly enveloping the Eldridge, a fog that seemed to emanate from the water itself, crackling with an unnatural energy. It clung to the hull like a shroud, obscuring the ship from view. Then, with a blinding flash of blue light, the impossible happened. The USS Eldridge, a 10,000-ton vessel of solid American steel, vanished. It wasn't just gone from radar, it was gone from sight. The space it occupied was now just empty water, the churning wake of its propellers the only evidence it had ever been there. For several minutes, there was only stunned silence. But the true horror was not what happened in Philadelphia. It was what was happening at that exact same moment over 200 miles away at the naval base in Norfolk, Virginia. Sailors there reported the sudden, shocking appearance of a destroyer escort surrounded by the same eerie green fog, sitting in the harbor for several minutes before vanishing as quickly as it had arrived. It was the Eldridge. The ship had not just become invisible, it had seemingly teleported. When it reappeared back in Philadelphia, the dockside observers knew something had gone catastrophically wrong. The screaming from the deck was the first sign. The official logs show nothing. The records were sealed, the witnesses silenced. For years, the story was just a phantom, a whisper among sailors, until a series of bizarre, annotated letters from a man named Carlos Allende landed on the desk of an astronomer, letters that claimed to hold the terrifying truth of what really happened to the crew of the USS Eldridge. This story is about to get much darker. To make sure you don't miss where this investigation leads, take 1 second to subscribe and click the bell. The man called himself Carlos Allende, but his real name was Carl Meredith Allen, a name that would become a ghost in the machine of a government cover-up. His letters were a frantic, rambling confession from a man who claimed he watched the entire Philadelphia experiment from the deck of a nearby merchant marine ship, the SS Andrew Furuseth. The recipient of these letters was Morris K. Jessup, a respected astronomer who had veered into the controversial world of UFO research. Jessup's 1955 book, The Case for the UFO, had made him a magnet for fringe ideas, but nothing could have prepared him for the story that unspooled in Allende's multicolored ink. Allende's correspondence was a chaotic mix of naval jargon and what seemed like science fiction, describing the USS Eldridge's crew in terrifying detail. He spoke of the sailors caught in the deep freeze, men who became stuck in time, unable to move or speak for hours unless touched by their crewmates. He described others who simply burst into flames, becoming human torches on the deck, burning for 18 days straight. But the most horrifying claim was the after effect he called the phasing. Men would become transparent, their forms flickering in and out of existence. They would walk through solid walls, disappearing for minutes, hours, or even months, only to reappear in a state of sheer terror. Some, he claimed, never came back at all. To Jessup, it was the deranged but captivating tale of a madman. He exchanged a few letters with Allende, but eventually dismissed him, filing the story away as a bizarre piece of fan mail. The story should have died there, but then the United States government got involved. A copy of Jessup's book mysteriously arrived at the Office of Naval Research in Washington, D.C. The pages were filled with extensive, handwritten annotations, all in the same frantic, multicolored style as Allende's letters, expanding on the horrors of the experiment. The notes spoke of alien technology, of advanced physics, and the terrifying consequences of tearing a hole in the fabric of reality. Instead of dismissing the book, the ONR took an extraordinary step. They located Morris Jessup and brought him to Washington. They asked him about the experiment, about Allende, about the theories in his book. Then they did something that remains inexplicable to this day. The ONR officially republished Jessup's book in a highly limited, classified run with every single one of Allende's strange annotations. This document, known as the Varro edition, became an underground legend, a classified government publication confirming the ravings of a potential lunatic. For Morris Jessup, it was a curse. He became withdrawn and paranoid, telling friends he was being watched and was on the verge of a breakthrough that would prove the entire event. He felt he had stumbled upon a truth the government was desperate to contain, a truth that had already driven sailors insane and now threatened him. He arranged a meeting with a colleague, promising to deliver definitive proof. That meeting never took place. On the evening of April 20th, 1959, Morris K. Jessup was found dead in his car in a Florida park, a hose connected from the exhaust pipe to the interior. The official ruling was suicide, but those closest to him suspected something far more sinister. A man on the brink of exposing a terrifying secret doesn't just give up. That's what Morris Jessup's friends believed. They pointed to the missing suicide note, the lack of a thorough autopsy, and reports that he was not despondent, but energized by his research in his final days. With his death, the investigation into Project Rainbow wasn't just silenced, it was orphaned. The official explanation was a closed book. But for those who had seen the Varro edition, Jessup's death looked less like a suicide and more like a permanent solution. For 2 decades, the story festered in the shadows, becoming a modern myth whispered among a new generation of paranormal researchers. The tale of the USS Eldridge was no longer an investigation, it was a legend
a foundational text in the gospel of government conspiracy. Then, in the late 1970s, the case was resurrected. Authors William Moore and Charles Berlitz, famous for his work on the Bermuda Triangle, decided to chase the ghost that had haunted Morris Jessup to his grave. They meticulously retraced his steps, poring over the Varro edition and old naval records. They knew the entire story hinged on one man, the enigmatic Carlos Allende, or Carl Allen. But finding a merchant mariner and drifter decades after the fact was a near impossible task. For years, Allen remained a phantom, a name without a face. Moore pursued leads across the country, following a breadcrumb trail of Social Security records and hearsay, determined to find the story's single self-proclaimed witness. Finally, in 1979, he found him. Carl Allen was living in a quiet retirement home, a man weathered by a hard life, his mind a labyrinth of memories. In a series of interviews, the truth finally seemed to surface. Allen confessed. He admitted that he had fabricated the entire story. He explained that he had been listening to sailors swat tall tales in a bar, heard snippets about strange experiments with invisibility, and decided to weave them into a grand, fantastical narrative to spook the UFO author, Morris Jessup. He said the multicolored inks, the frantic annotations, and the scientific jargon were all part of an elaborate prank that had spiraled catastrophically out of his control. He expressed remorse for the effect it had on Jessup's life, framing the entire affair as a tragic misunderstanding. The case seemed to be solved. The confession of a lonely, intelligent drifter offered a simple, logical explanation that erased the green fog, the teleporting ship, and the men trapped in steel. But William Moore wasn't convinced. Allen's confession felt hearsed, hollow, the words of a man trying to bury a story rather than reveal the truth. And there were elements he couldn't explain, naval terminology and project details that a simple merchant seaman should never have known. The biggest question remained unanswered. If it was all a hoax concocted by a single, unimportant man, why did the Office of Naval Research treat it like a matter of the utmost national security?
A madman's prank doesn't get classified by the government. With Carl Allen's confession now suspect, investigators turned their focus from the witness to the institution. They began to pull at the threads of the official narrative, and what they found was a carefully constructed wall of denial, contradictions, and documents that were just a little too perfect. For decades, the Navy's position has been unwavering and absolute. The Philadelphia experiment never happened. No project involving invisibility or teleportation ever existed. Furthermore, they produced the complete war diary and declog of the USS Eldridge, which seemingly proved that on October 28, 1943, the ship wasn't in Philadelphia at all. The logs state it was in Newark Harbor, and subsequently on its maiden shakedown cruise in the Bahamas. For any other story, this would be the final word, a verifiable official record disproving a wild rumor. But researchers who dug deeper found troubling inconsistencies. The ship's log, while detailed, felt sterile. For a newly commissioned vessel on its very first cruise, the entries were unusually sparse, lacking the typical detail of a shakedown voyage. More suspiciously, the handwriting in certain sections appeared to change, and key pages covering the period in question seemed almost too pristine. Theories emerged that the logs had been expertly forged, a paper alibi created after the fact. Others suggested a more cunning deception, that the Eldridge was deliberately chosen as a scapegoat, its name leaked to send investigators down a false trail, while the true ship used in the experiment remained a secret. In the search for a rational explanation,
Some researchers pointed to a very real and highly classified wartime technology, degaussing. This process involved wrapping a ship in a massive web of electrical cables and pulsing it with a powerful electromagnetic field. The goal was to cancel out the ship's magnetic signature, rendering it invisible to German magnetic torpedoes. This top-secret procedure would have produced a strange electrical corona, a low hum, and would have been completely baffling to any sailor who witnessed it without context. It's plausible that sailors witnessing a ship surrounded by a strange energy field could have spun the tale of true invisibility, a rumor that grew more fantastic with each telling. Combine this with rare atmospheric phenomena common at sea, like St. Elmo's fire or temperature inversions that can bend light and create powerful mirages, and a scientific explanation begins to form. Perhaps the green fog was a natural event, and the ship's disappearance was nothing more than a trick of the light, coinciding with a secret military test. It's a neat theory that cleans up all the messy details, reducing the legend to a perfect storm of rumor, real technology, and strange weather. A simple case of misinterpretation. Except for one thing. In the late 1980s, a man named Al Bielek came forward. He claimed the scientific explanations were a deliberate smokescreen. He claimed he was a survivor of the Philadelphia experiment, and he hadn't just teleported to Norfolk. He said he had traveled through time.
Time travel was not a part of the original legend. It was a secret, Al Bielek claimed, so profound and terrifying that the survivors were programmed to forget. He insisted his real name wasn't Al Bielek, it was Edward Cameron, a physicist who, along with his brother Duncan, had been on the bridge of the USS Eldridge when the experiment tore a hole through space-time itself. His testimony transformed the story from a military secret into a science fiction epic. According to Bielek, when the Eldridge vanished from Philadelphia, it didn't just reappear in Norfolk. It was ripped out of 1943 and thrown 40 years into the future, materializing in the year 1983 at a secret underground military base in Montauk, Long Island, where a successor program was conducting its own dangerous experiments with reality. This new location, Montauk, was allegedly the dark heart of a project that made Project Rainbow look like child's play. Bielek claimed the scientists in 1983 were unable to shut down their own experiment, and it had locked on to the Eldridge, creating a catastrophic temporal rift between the two eras. To escape the chaos, he and his brother jumped overboard, but instead of hitting the cold Atlantic water, they landed on the hard ground of the Montauk base in 1983. He described the horrors this temporal link unleashed on the Eldridge's crew, men aging and de-aging in seconds, others becoming trapped in agonizing time loops, their bodies and minds shattered by the experience. This, he claimed, was the source of the phasing and madness that the first witness, Carl Allen, had tried to describe. Bielek's story grew even stranger. He alleged that after being captured by the authorities at Montauk, his brother was sent back in time, and he himself was subjected to a bizarre process of de-aging and memory wiping. His consciousness, he claimed, was removed from his original body and placed into a new one, that of a child named Al Bielek, born into a different family to live out a fabricated life. For decades, he had no memory of being Edward Cameron. He said the buried memories only began to surface in the late 1980s, triggered after he watched a film adaptation of the Philadelphia experiment, which shattered his mental conditioning. To skeptics, the story was pure fantasy. Investigators found no birth certificate for an Edward Cameron, no record of him or his brother serving in the Navy, and no corroborating evidence for any of his claims. His narrative was filled with contradictions and scientific impossibilities, relying entirely on his own hypnotic and impassioned testimony. He was dismissed by the mainstream as a confabulator at best, a charlatan at worst. And yet his testimony, however flawed, reignited a powerful question.
Why does this story refuse to die? Decades after the war, with witnesses dead and documents sealed, the legend of the USS Eldridge continues to haunt the edges of history. The final truth may not lie in tales of time travel, but in a far more tangible and heartbreaking place: the sealed medical records and forgotten graves of the men who served on the real USS Eldridge.
In the end, after all the tales of green fog, teleportation, and time travel, the truth of the Philadelphia experiment is likely not found in classified physics, but in the quiet suffering of ordinary men. When you strip away the legend, you are left with the ship itself, the USS Eldridge, and the documented, verifiable history of its crew. That history is not one of paranormal science, but of distinguished service. The real USS Eldridge spent the war escorting convoys across the treacherous, U-boat-infested waters of the Atlantic. It protected troop transports, guarded supply lines, and engaged the enemy in the Mediterranean. Its crew were not lab rats in a quantum experiment. They were sailors, fighting and surviving one of the most brutal naval campaigns in history. They earned battle stars for their courage, a fact utterly eclipsed by the myth. The legend speaks of men driven mad, and on this single point, the story may touch the truth, but for a far more common and tragic reason. The psychological toll of convoy duty in 1943 was immense. It was a life of constant, grinding fear, the terror of a torpedo strike in the dead of night, the concussive shock of depth charges, the knowledge that a fiery death could come at any second from an enemy you could not see. The men who survived this ordeal were often changed forever, suffering from what was then called shell shock or combat fatigue. Today, we call it post-traumatic stress disorder. The madness of the Eldridge's crew was likely real, but it wasn't caused by phasing through dimensions. It was the brutal, invisible wound of war. Here, in the fog of real trauma, the myth was likely born. A troubled and imaginative merchant mariner, Carl Allen, hears traumatized sailors in a portside bar, swapping fragmented stories of their horrific experiences, mixed with whispers of a new, secret degaussing technology they didn't understand. He weaves these threads together into a fantastic narrative and sends it to Morris Jessup, an academic already primed to believe in the unbelievable. Jessup's personal tragedies and mysterious death are then misinterpreted as assassination, creating the illusion of a cover-up. A strange bureaucratic decision by the Office of Naval Research is seen as official confirmation, and a legend is cemented in paranoia. Decades later, storytellers like Al Bielek add new, impossible layers, and the tale spirals into a modern epic. The USS Eldridge was eventually sold to the Greek Navy, where it served for another 2 decades before being sold for scrap in the 1990s. Its steel, once rumored to have merged with human flesh, was melted down, its final secrets dissolved into oblivion. Perhaps the Philadelphia experiment did happen, not as an event in physics, but as an event in human psychology. It became a vessel for our fears of unchecked technology and our deep-seated distrust of authority. The real tragedy is not that a ship turned invisible. It's that a spectacular fiction has completely erased a true story of duty and sacrifice. The real ghosts are not sailors lost in time, but the forgotten histories of the men who actually served. Their genuine bravery and private pain eclipsed forever by one of the most powerful and persistent legends of the 20th century.